It was just another ordinary morning in Austin, Texas, back in 2026. That was the day the restaurant I had spent 27 years building with my own two hands was taken right out from under me. Porch. The air that morning was filled with the familiar aroma of freshly baked maple pecan cinnamon rolls and dark roast Colombian coffee, exactly like every single day since we first opened our doors in 1999. But before I even had the chance to tie on my navy blue apron, a man in a tailored suit handed me a manila folder. Porch. In a voice that was almost suffocatingly calm, he informed me that I was no longer a co-founder or an owner of the business. My husband, Richard McAllister, had sold the Oak and Ember restaurant in its entirety, including every single piece of equity that belonged to me. As I stood there feeling like all the air had been pulled straight from my lungs, the new owner walked up. Porch. He looked me right in the eye and said quietly, "Mrs. McAllister, before you walk away, I want to ask you a question. Would you be willing to stay and help me save this place?" Whenever people asked who was behind the success of Oak and Ember, they almost always looked at my husband. Richard had that warm, confident Texas smile. He would shake their hands and humbly say that it was a team effort. Porch. He was not lying, but he certainly was not telling the whole truth either. The real truth was the smell of slow-simmered tomato sauce clinging to my apron after 14-hour shifts. It was the roar of the commercial mixer at 4 a.m, while the rest of Austin was still fast asleep. Porch. It was aching feet, flour-dusted hands, and countless birthdays spent in a cramped back office because there was simply no time to drive home. I was 61 years old, and every corner of that building held a piece of my youth. 27 years ago, Richard and I were just a regular middle-class couple. Porch. We drove a beaten-up Ford F-150, had 2 young kids in the back, very little money in our pockets, and a mountain of determination. I still remember the day we signed the commercial lease. That building on the east side of Austin was in terrible shape. The paint was peeling, ceiling tiles were broken, and the old vinyl booths were split wide open. Porch. Any sensible investor would have walked away on the spot. But I stood in the middle of that empty dining room, closed my eyes, and could already hear the laughter filling every table. "I can see it," I whispered. Richard smiled, put his arm around my shoulder, and said, "What do you see? Our future. Then let's go build it." Back then, I believed every word he said. Porch. We leveraged everything we owned and maxed out our credit cards. Our savings were completely gone before our very first customer ever walked through the door. The loan officer at Bank of America nearly turned down our commercial loan twice. I remember sitting next to Richard in that small bank office, gripping his hand tightly under the desk while the officer flipped through our paperwork. Porch. "We are taking a huge risk on you two," the loan officer finally told us. "We will not let you down," Richard promised. Those first 6 months pushed us to the absolute limit. I cooked breakfast before sunrise, prepped lunch before noon, baked fresh desserts between dinner rushes, and did not shut down the kitchen until past midnight. Porch. There were nights I literally slept on 50-pound sacks of flour in the dry storage room, because driving 40 minutes out to the suburbs, just to get 3 hours of sleep, made no sense. Richard handled payroll, vendor taxes, and invoices. We had different roles, but we worked just as hard. That was what a marriage was supposed to look like. Or at least that was what I believed. Porch. During those early difficult days, we had one evening where only 3 customers walked in, just 3. I stared out at the empty room, fighting back tears. "We are going to lose everything," I said, my voice shaking. Richard reached across the counter and took my hand. "No, we won't. What if people just don't come?" "They will." "How do you know that?" Porch. He smiled at me and said, "Because nobody cooks the way you do." Those words carried me through so many hard years. Whenever self-doubt crept in, I remembered what he said. Slowly but surely, the community showed up. One family brought another. The local high school football team made us their regular Friday night spot, and professors from UT Austin came to celebrate their retirements. Porch. Couples who had their first dates in our booths years ago started bringing their own children back to eat with us. Before long, people were not just coming for dinner, they were coming to make memories. Every single recipe on that menu was a piece of my life. My grandmother's Texas Hill Country peach pie, my mother's southern fried chicken, and my bourbon-glazed roast that took nearly 6 months to perfect, which sold out early every single Saturday night. Customers would constantly ask to buy the recipe, and I would always laugh and tell them it was a trade secret, and more importantly, a family secret. They were not just recipes to me. They were a part of who I was. Nearly 20 years in, an elderly woman named Eleanor stopped me while I was clearing a table. She looked up and asked, "You must be Olivia." "I am," I replied. She took my hand across the table and said, "My husband proposed to me in this exact booth." I smiled. "That is wonderful." She gently shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. What is truly wonderful is that after he passed, this became the only place where I still feel at home. I did not know what to say, so I just leaned in and gave her a long hug. From that day on, Eleanor came in every Friday. Always booth number 7. Always the southern fried chicken, and always the peach pie. Sometimes she would sit for 2 hours just talking with me. She became family. There were dozens of regulars just like Eleanor. Oak and Ember was no longer just a business. It was the beating heart of our neighborhood. Our head chef, Mateo, understood that better than anyone. He joined us in our second year as a dishwasher, worked his way up through prep, and over the years, I promoted him to executive chef. One afternoon, while chopping onions, he smiled and asked me, "Do you know why I never left for one of those high-end downtown spots?" "You tell me," I said, "because you taught me how to cook." I laughed. "That was just my job." He shook his head. "No. You taught me what dignity means in a kitchen." Staff came and went, but Mateo stayed. Chloe came along much later. She was 23 when she applied for the host stand, fresh out of UT Austin, incredibly organized and eager to learn. Within 5 years, she was managing the front of the house better than anyone I had ever seen. "Mrs. McAllister," she asked me one day, "how do you remember everyone's name?" "I don't just remember names, I remember their stories," I told her with a smile. I forget my own family's birthdays sometimes, but people don't come back because you memorize their order. They come back because you remember who they are. She never forgot that lesson, and neither did I. Unfortunately, those were the exact things Richard stopped caring about. As the restaurant grew more profitable and Austin turned into a booming tech hub, Richard spent less and less time on the floor. He started attending investment seminars, business forums, and high-end networking dinners. His mind became completely consumed with expansion. "We could open 3 locations," he would say over breakfast. "Maybe 5. We could even franchise." "I don't want 5 locations," I told him. "Why not?" "Because I can't be in 5 kitchens at once." "You don't need to be. We hire people. Hired help won't love this place the way we do." He rolled his eyes. "You are far too sentimental, Olivia. Maybe I was. But customers do not drive across town for numbers on a balance sheet. They come because someone genuinely cares about their experience." Richard became obsessed with growth metrics instead of people. Financial spreadsheets replaced our casual dinner conversations. Every evening, our kitchen table was covered in papers, profit margin charts, revenue projections, and return on investment models. One night, I asked him, "Do you ever miss just working in the restaurant?" "I am working," he answered. "You know what I mean." He hesitated, then looked up at me and said, "I built an empire, Olivia." I smiled gently and corrected him, "We built it." He paused for a second. Of course, it was just one word, but deep down something felt fractured. After almost 30 years, our we had quietly turned into he. I tried to convince myself that I was just overthinking things. People change, businesses scale, and marriages evolve. Those thoughts comforted me for a while, until the small details began piling up. Richard stopped having dinner at the restaurant. He started taking meetings with people I had never met. He stayed late in his office several nights a week. Whenever I asked who he was meeting with, his answer was always smooth. Orch. Accountants, private equity attorneys, business consultants. It sounded entirely reasonable. A little too reasonable. Still, I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, the father of my children, the man who had promised we would build our dreams side by side. It never crossed my mind that he was constructing a completely different plan behind my back, one that did not include me at all. And I certainly never imagined it would cost me everything we had spent 27 years creating. Looking back, a marriage does not collapse overnight. It comes apart in silence. About 2 years before Richard sold the restaurant, I noticed the first real shift. He stopped walking the dining room floor. For decades, his routine after the dinner rush was to stroll around, stop at tables, shake hands with regulars, and ask the kids if they left room for dessert. People loved him. His natural charm perfectly balanced my quieter personality. Gradually, those evening walks disappeared. Instead, as soon as the daily register reports were pulled, he would slip out through the back door. I have another meeting, he would always say. With who? I would ask. Financial advisors. I wanted to believe him. Running a business had gotten complicated over the years. Payroll taxes, rising food costs, and new labor regulations came up every quarter. It made sense that he needed more administrative meetings than before. Yet, that uneasy feeling in the back of my mind refused to go away. One Tuesday afternoon, Chloe walked over while I was frosting a carrot cake. Mrs. McAllister. I looked up. What is it, sweetie? She hesitated. I really don't know if I should say anything. You can always talk to me. She glanced toward Richard's office. I've noticed Mr. McAllister bringing people in after closing lately. I kept frosting the cake, trying to sound completely unbothered. Business consultants? I don't know. They just go straight into his office, shut the door, and stay in there for hours. I gave her a reassuring smile. It's probably just CPAs going over our books. She nodded, though she did not look convinced. Neither was I. A week later, I saw it for myself. After dinner service, I realized I had left my reading glasses in the kitchen and walked back to get them. The light in Richard's office was still on, and the door was cracked open just an inch. Through the gap, I saw a woman sitting across from him. She looked to be in her early 40s, dressed sharply in a navy blazer, with an open leather portfolio on the desk between them. Richard saw me before she did. He stood up quickly, his chair scraping against the floor. Olivia? I just forgot my glasses. His smile came a little too fast, a little too tight. This is Vanessa Holloway. The woman stood up and offered her hand. It is so wonderful to finally meet you. Her smile was polished, almost rehearsed. I shook her hand. Richard jumped right in. Vanessa is helping us review some long-term financial strategies and tax structures for the business. I see, I said, nodding. That sounds good. Hiring a financial consultant was standard practice, or at least that was what I told myself on the drive home. But whenever we had done restructuring in the past, Richard had always shared the names of the attorneys and accountants with me. I had never heard the name Vanessa Holloway in my life. The meetings became more frequent, sometimes twice a week, sometimes on Saturday afternoons. Whenever I asked how things were progressing, Richard buried me under technical jargon, talking about valuation models, debt restructuring, and tax optimization. The numbers became a wall built specifically to keep me out. One afternoon, I was standing in the pantry, staring blankly at unopened boxes. Matteo walked in. Are you doing all right? I honestly don't know. He glanced toward Richard's office and lowered his voice. I have worked here for 25 years. I have never seen you look this stressed. I crossed my arms. I don't even know what I'm stressed about. Then let me tell you, Matteo said, looking straight at me. This restaurant has always had two captains. Right now, it feels like only one person is steering the ship. A month later, Richard asked me out to dinner. Just the two of us, at an Italian spot across town where nobody knew who we were. During the meal, Richard spread out several glossy brochures on the table, featuring luxury boutique hotels, commercial real estate developments, and shopping plazas. "What is all this?" I asked. "Investment opportunities," he said smoothly. "We need to diversify." "With what money? Everything we have is tied up in the restaurant." "The restaurant itself carries a very high valuation." I frowned. "George, it's not for sale. I never said it was. But you need to start thinking like an investor." I reached across the table and touched his hand. "We are restaurant people, Richard." He gently pulled his hand back. "No, Olivia. We are entrepreneurs." It was such a subtle movement and a simple sentence. But right then, it felt like I was having dinner with a complete stranger. George, the man who used to celebrate a perfectly flaky pie crust, now only talked about market valuations. The man who used to know every employee's birthday now only talked about scalability. A few weeks later, I arrived at the restaurant earlier than usual. Richard was not expecting me. As I walked past his office, I heard voices coming from inside. "She doesn't need to know yet," Richard was saying. "George." I froze in my tracks, Vanessa replied in a low murmur. Then Richard spoke again. "Once all the legal documents are executed, it will be far too late for her to raise any objections." My heart pounded heavily against my chest. For a second, I wanted to push the door open and confront them right there. But I didn't. After 38 years of marriage, I chose to fall back on trust. George. I told myself I must have taken what they said out of context. I had no idea that while I was using trust to protect our marriage, Richard was using silence to execute his exit strategy. The day everything came crashing down started just like any regular Wednesday. George. At 5:30 in the morning, I unlocked the front door, turned on the dining room lights one by one, and stood there quietly for a moment taking it all in. Around 11 that morning, I saw 3 unfamiliar vehicles pull into our parking lot. A black Range Rover, a silver Lexus, and a dark SUV. These were not lunch customers. This was a formal business visit. George. Richard walked outside before they even reached the entrance. He was wearing the tailored navy suit he usually reserved for high-stakes meetings with bank executives. Vanessa stepped out of the second vehicle holding her leather portfolio. George. Walking behind them was a man I had never seen before. Someone in his late 40s wearing a well-fitted charcoal suit, calm, self-assured, and carrying himself with quiet authority. Behind him walked another man and woman with briefcases. Lawyers. The thought flashed instantly through my mind. Richard shook hands with every one of them. George. Then he glanced toward the dining room, and through the glass our eyes locked. For a split second, a look that resembled guilt crossed his face, but it vanished almost immediately. He motioned for the group to follow him into the private dining room we reserved for corporate events. Chloe slipped quietly beside me. "Mrs. McAllister, should I set up lunch for the meeting?" "Did Mr. George McAllister mention what this was about?" "No," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. A little after 2 in the afternoon, Richard stepped out of the private room. "Olivia," he said in a tone that was completely formal, "can we talk for a minute?" My stomach dropped. Of course, he led me into his office. Vanessa was already seated inside. George. The tall stranger stood over by the window while the attorneys sat on the leather couch. The room felt heavy with an odd sense of ceremony. Richard closed the door behind us. "What is going on?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "I should have told you earlier." A chill ran down my spine. "Told me what?" He glanced at Vanessa, then looked back at me. "The restaurant has been sold." George. For a few seconds, I honestly thought my ears were playing tricks on me. "What did you say?" "The transaction closed this morning." I let out a dry laugh, simply because my brain could not process what he was saying. "Richard, what kind of joke is this?" He folded his hands over his desk. "I sold the company." George. It was an incredible financial opportunity, and all the legal paperwork has already been signed. A wave of cold dread washed over me. How could you possibly sell our restaurant without my consent? His expression remained completely detached. "Everything has been taken care of. What does that even mean?" It means that legally, the sale is final. I looked over at Vanessa, but she looked away. Orch. I turned right back to Richard. What about my equity? In Texas, this is marital property, and those shares are registered under my name. He barely hesitated. Your interests were included in the agreement. The entire legal entity has been transferred. I could hardly breathe. You sold my shares? I sold the business. You sold my entire life's work. My voice rose, and I could not stop it. Orch. I built this place. So did I. Richard's jaw tightened, and it was acquired at peak valuation. We made more than enough to retire comfortably. I never asked to retire. At that moment, the tall man standing by the window finally stepped forward. Mrs. McAllister. I turned slowly to face him. My name is Nathan Caldwell, he said calmly. I am the buyer. Orch. Hearing those words hurt worse than anything Richard had said. Nathan extended his hand. I kept mine at my side. He lowered his hand with respect. I understand that this is an incredibly difficult situation. I looked straight into his eyes. You knew he was selling someone else's life out from under them. His expression turned serious. Orch. I was under the clear impression that both owners were fully aligned on this decision. You were wrong. The office went completely silent. Richard snapped. Nathan. Please. Nathan completely ignored him, keeping his focus on me. I was informed that all necessary legal authorizations and signatures had been secured. They were not. The tears finally spilled over. Orch. I could not stay in that room for another second. I turned around and headed straight for the door. Olivia! Richard called out from behind me. I did not stop. When I stepped into the hallway, the entire staff already knew something was terribly wrong. Chloe stood frozen at the host stand. Mateo walked out of the kitchen, his apron still on, and the servers had stopped mid-stride. Orch. Richard came out right behind me. Using that same polished, corporate tone, he addressed the room. The restaurant is under new ownership, effective immediately. Mateo stared at him in utter disbelief. As for Olivia, Richard added before I could say a word, she will be stepping away. The dining room went completely silent. Several customers looked up from their plates. Orch. 27 years, thousands of memories and relationships reduced to a single sentence. She will be stepping away. I had to grab the back of a nearby chair just to keep my balance. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like I had no place to go. Then, I heard footsteps behind me. Nathan Caldwell walked into the dining area. He gave Richard a sharp look, then turned toward me. Orch. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, meant only for those standing near us. Mrs. McAllister. I slowly lifted my head. If you are willing, he paused. Before you make any final decisions, I would like to ask you one thing. I said nothing, he continued. Would you be open to staying? Orch. Not because I bought this place, but because after spending just one afternoon here, I realize this restaurant may have been purchased from your husband, but it was built by you. I barely slept that night. The next morning at 7, my daughter Harper called. Mom, I stayed up all night thinking about this. You said yesterday that you never saw any sales agreements. Orch. Have you signed anything recently that gave up your ownership or consented to a sale? Absolutely not. What about older documents? I leaned against the kitchen counter. We restructured a commercial loan a few years back. There were annual tax filings and insurance renewals. But I would never knowingly sign away my equity in the restaurant. Harper went quiet for a second. Orch. Then maybe you didn't sign it at all. That statement hit me like a revelation. I stopped asking myself how Richard could do this, and I started asking how he managed to convince attorneys and a buyer that he had the legal authority to do it. At 10 that morning, Nathan Caldwell called, asking to meet in person. There are several questions I could not ask yesterday in front of everyone. Orch. We met at an independent coffee shop in downtown Austin. No lawyers, no assistants. I owe you a sincere apology, Nathan said as soon as we sat down. During my negotiations with Richard, I genuinely believed he was speaking on behalf of both of you. I requested joint meetings with you twice, but he told me you preferred not to deal with financial matters. A hollow feeling washed over me. That is completely untrue. I see that now. Nathan pulled a file from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Inside were printed copies of several email exchanges. In each one, Nathan had formally requested a meeting with both owners. Richard's responses were chilling. Olivia is not interested in these discussions. She prefers that I handle all business affairs. She is completely comfortable with whatever decisions I make. I looked up at Nathan. Why are you showing me this now? Because integrity matters, Nathan replied, his gaze firm. I have acquired 7 businesses, and I have never built a portfolio on deception. If someone intentionally kept you out of the loop, Mrs. McAllister, did you ever assign your shares to him? No. Did you ever execute a formal retirement buyout or grant a power of attorney? Never. Nathan let out a slow breath. I strongly urge you to retain legal counsel immediately. He told me the proceeds were for our joint retirement, but I have not seen a single dollar. I cannot even afford an attorney right now. A look of genuine shock appeared on Nathan's face. He didn't just deceive you, he misrepresented the financial structure to me as well. If you retain an attorney, I will fully cooperate with your legal team. Armed with those emails, I went straight home and did what I should have done a long time ago. I opened the dusty filing cabinet in our home study. In a folder from a corporate restructuring 7 years prior, I found an amended operating agreement loaded with heavy legal terminology. One particular sentence made my blood run cold. Management authority may be delegated pursuant to subsequent resolutions. That had been his very first step in consolidating control. The next morning, Harper walked with me into the offices of one of the top commercial litigation firms in Austin. We met with a senior partner named Sarah Jenkins. I laid out the entire story, the 27 years of history, Nathan's emails, and the old corporate documents from our study. Sarah took detailed notes before looking up. These emails are significant because they show the buyer expected dual authorization. But we need hard documentation, not assumptions. I have already submitted an expedited request to the Texas Secretary of State for the LLC's full corporate filings and the closing documents from this transaction. 2 days later, we were back in Sarah's conference room. Sarah's demeanor was completely serious as she laid several documents bearing state seals onto the table. First, according to official records with the Secretary of State, your name, Olivia McAllister, was never removed from the ownership roster. Legally speaking, your ownership interest remains fully intact. Harper let out a sigh of relief. So Mom is still an owner? Hold on. Sarah raised a hand. That is where the problem lies. I went through the entire closing package, and there is no legally sound document transferring Olivia's equity. She paused, pulling a single page from the last folder. However, there is a document titled Spousal Consent and Resolution to Sell. This is the document the seller's counsel used to certify to the buyer that Olivia had fully consented to the transaction. She placed the paper directly in front of me. There is a signature here that raises serious concerns. I looked down at the line. At first glance, it looked remarkably like my handwriting. The curve of the O and the habitual underline beneath McAllister were nearly identical. But as I stared at it for a few moments, a deep, unsettling certainty took over. Sarah pulled out my original 1999 founding signatures and the mortgage documents from 7 years ago. Look closely. When you sign your name, you have a natural micropause where the pen lifts slightly. That pause is missing here. Furthermore, your capital M is always rounded with an upward sweep, whereas this signature has sharp, rigid angles. Harper gasped. Sarah took off her glasses, her eyes sharp. I do not want to jump to conclusions, but I have already retained a forensic document examiner who regularly testifies in federal court. Because if my assessment is correct, Olivia, you never signed this document. The room fell dead silent. I stared at that forged signature. While my world felt like it was breaking apart, an overwhelming sense of clarity settled over me. All this time, I thought Richard had simply hidden the truth from me. Now I knew that someone had manufactured a calculated lie. This was deliberate commercial fraud. During the 5 days we waited for the forensic expert's formal report, I felt like I was living in a strange vacuum. I did not step foot inside the restaurant, and I ignored every single call from Richard. At first, I felt an urge to prove that my husband had betrayed me. But I didn't need to anymore. The legal documents and the people who witnessed his deception were already putting the pieces together for me. And somewhere in that mountain of corporate records, I knew the final piece of the puzzle would surface. On Thursday morning, the doorbell rang. Standing on the front porch was my son, Ethan. After graduating from the UT Business School, Ethan had joined the management side of the restaurant, spending most of his time in the back office managing vendor contracts and inventory software. He had always looked up to Richard. Right now, he looked completely exhausted. Dark circles hung under his eyes, and his usual bright, confident posture was completely gone. "Good morning, Mom." "Can I come in?" I stepped aside to let him through. He walked slowly into the living room, glancing around as if noticing the family photos on the wall for the first time. We sat down on the sofa, and for a full minute neither of us said a word. Finally, he turned to me. "I owe you an apology." I waited quietly. I defended Dad through all of this. He swallowed hard, clearly struggling. I honestly thought he was just making a smart financial exit, trying to sell at the top while the Texas market was booming. "I swear to you, Mom, I had no idea you hadn't agreed to it." I looked closely at his face. "You knew he was negotiating with buyers? I knew he was meeting with people. But Dad told me you were tired of handling the business side and that you wanted to step away completely." The exact same lie, word for word. That realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Richard had not just lied to Nathan, he had lied to our own children. "Ethan." I took a deep breath. "When did he first tell you that?" He thought for a moment. "Months ago, before serious negotiations even started." I nodded slowly. Every answer added another solid piece of evidence against the false story Richard had built. With tears in his eyes, Ethan asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked over at the dining table, which was still covered in old files from the study and the emails Nathan had provided. "I am going to find out exactly what was signed under my name," I said, looking back at Ethan. "And I am going to find out what your father thought he could cover up." Because when someone has to tell the exact same lie to the buyer, to his children, to his staff, and to the entire community, it is usually because he is trying to hide a truth he knows he cannot defend. 2 days later, Richard could no longer keep his patience. He sent me a text. "We need to talk, just the two of us. I am waiting on the back patio." When I drove up to the suburban house we had shared for over 30 years, Richard was sitting on the back deck with 2 freshly brewed cups of coffee on the table. For a brief second, it looked just like any lazy Saturday morning we had shared over the decades. He pushed one of the mugs toward me. "Still just a splash of cream, right?" I did not touch the cup. "I am sorry for how hurt you feel," Richard said, breaking the silence. I looked straight at him. "You chose your words very carefully, Richard." "What do you mean by that?" "You said you are sorry for how hurt I feel, but you didn't say you are sorry for what you did." His jaw tightened up. "I made a business decision, Olivia. You made a marital decision, and you forged my signature to do it." "It was not personal," he raised his voice. I looked at him coldly. "You sold out 27 years of my life, and you honestly have the nerve to tell me it wasn't personal?" Richard rubbed the bridge of his nose, clearly irritated. "Oak and Ember hit a ceiling. Yes, it was profitable, but its valuation on the open market was astronomical. We are talking about a multi-million-dollar exit. You get so emotional about everything. You never once learned to think like a partner." "That is because I never treated our life's work like a cheap stock ticker to dump at the first high bid." A heavy silence settled over the patio. Finally, I looked him in the eye and asked the question that mattered most. Why did you tell Nathan Caldwell that I had no interest in joining the meetings? His eyes shifted slightly. George, who told you that? So it is true. Why did you hide it from me? Richard stared out across the manicured lawn. Because I knew you would say no. You would have dragged the process out with endless arguments, and that would have stalled the entire acquisition. And there it was. No remorse, only convenience. He had not kept me in the dark to protect my feelings. George, he did it because my presence stood in the way of his payday. Richard, I asked quietly, did it ever cross your mind, even for a single second, that I had a legal and moral right to say no? He offered no answer. Instead, he tried to test the waters. What did your lawyer say to you? She is looking into some very interesting facts, I replied calmly. George, like the fact that my ownership was never legally transferred. Richard immediately shook his head. That is impossible. All the paperwork was handled. Handled by whom? I stared right through him. Vanessa? Did you blindly trust every single document she put in front of you? I watched his face closely. George. For the first time since this nightmare began, I saw genuine uncertainty flicker in his eyes. Not guilt, but real doubt. It was as if he suddenly realized he might not have had complete control over the machine he set in motion. I let out a faint laugh. Tell me, Richard, did you actually read every single word before signing off on it? He bristled. Of course I did. Every single word. George. The long, awkward silence that followed spoke far louder than any defensive answer. Right then, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Sarah, I answered immediately. Sarah? Olivia. Sarah's voice carried absolute confidence. The forensic document examiner just delivered his preliminary findings. Can you come down to the office right away? I hung up the phone and stood to my feet. George. Richard looked up at me. What is happening? I looked down at the man I had loved for 38 years. The truth, Richard. The kind of truth you can no longer outrun. By the time I reached the firm's conference room, Harper was already there. George. Sarah had several neat files laid out across the mahogany table, enlarged high-resolution photographs of signatures, microscopic stroke analyses, and a formal forensic report. Our document examiner has testified in state and federal courts for over 2 decades, Sarah said, sliding the report toward me. George. He compared that disputed signature against more than 60 authentic signatures you wrote over the past 27 years, ranging from our initial commercial loan paperwork and insurance policies to early vendor contracts. I took a steadying breath. What did he conclude? George. In his professional opinion, there is overwhelming evidence that the signature on that spousal consent was not executed by your hand. Harper covered her mouth. Sarah pointed to several highlighted sections. The examiner noted that your natural signature flows smoothly with consistent rhythm and microlifts. This signature, however, is full of hesitation marks. George. The pen pressure changes abruptly in unnatural places, and the stroke origins do not match your motor habits. His definitive conclusion is that this was a deliberate attempt to copy and trace your name. The room went completely still. Someone had not just kept me in the dark. They had misappropriated my identity to execute a fraudulent transaction. Can this prove who did it? I asked quietly. George. Sarah shook her head. The report proves the signature is invalid, but it cannot definitively identify the person who held the pen. However, that alone is enough for our legal action. Without a valid consent document, the legal foundation of the entire sale collapses. Just then, a light knock came at the door, and Nathan Caldwell walked in. He looked weary, but his posture was firm and resolute. George. Sarah quickly summarized the expert's conclusions. Nathan listened intently, let out a deep sigh, and removed his wire-rimmed glasses. My worst fears have been confirmed, he said, turning toward me. Olivia, you are owed a full accounting of what happened. He pulled several organized documents from his briefcase and placed them on the table. George. These are our full communication logs and the official minutes from our due diligence meetings, Nathan said in a low, measured voice. 6 days before the closing date, I specifically asked Richard why you were not present and whether you had given your explicit consent to the sale. Sarah picked up the minutes, her eyes scanning the text quickly. The record shows Richard stated on the record, Olivia has reviewed all documentation and fully authorized me to execute the transaction. Sarah looked up, shaking her head. Nathan then formally requested written verification of her consent. Nathan nodded, and Richard promised to provide it. 2 days later, he handed over the spousal consent carrying that forged signature. The full picture was now undeniable. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a calculated scheme where someone spoke for me without my knowledge, attended meetings in my absence, and signed away my life's work without my consent. I brought this directly to my board of directors, Nathan said, looking at me with sincere respect. My father ran a hardware store back in Ohio, but my mother was the one who managed the inventory, handled payroll, and kept the books balanced. Everyone assumed my father ran the show until he passed away, and people realized she had been carrying half the business the entire time. I know what it looks like when a woman's lifelong dedication is swept aside. I refuse to be complicit in doing that to you. He stood up and offered his hand. I have executed a sworn affidavit documenting every representation Richard made during negotiations. If this goes to a full trial, I will testify on your behalf without hesitation. I shook his hand firmly. In that moment, I realized I was not just fighting for a business. I was reclaiming my dignity. The following Tuesday, Sarah formally filed a lawsuit in the Travis County District Court, challenging the validity of the corporate transaction. The court summons was served directly to Richard that afternoon. Before setting a trial date, the presiding judge ordered all parties into mandatory civil mediation, standard procedure for commercial disputes in Texas. We convened at a neutral dispute resolution center around a polished boardroom table. Richard sat opposite us with his attorney, flanked by Vanessa Holloway, who kept her head down and refused to make eye contact with me. Nathan and his corporate counsel sat on the far side, while Sarah and I sat together. The mediator, a retired judge with years of experience, opened the session. Richard's counsel immediately claimed his client had acted under a good faith belief that he held complete managerial authority. Sarah calmly slid certified filings from the Texas Secretary of State across the table. The official record proves otherwise. Next, Sarah presented the certified forensic handwriting analysis. Richard's attorney frowned. We reserve the right to retain our own expert to review these conclusions. You certainly may, Sarah replied evenly. However, this report fully satisfies the Dauber standard and is entirely admissible as substantive evidence. Nathan's counsel then submitted the detailed due diligence transcripts. Seeing those logs, Richard's face went completely pale. You kept verbatim minutes of those calls? Our acquisition protocols require strict compliance documentation on every deal, Nathan answered coldly. The mediator reviewed the files, then turned his gaze to Richard. Mr. McAllister, these records show you repeatedly affirmed to the buyer that your wife had fully approved the sale. Richard tried to steady his voice. She trusted my business judgment. She never involved herself in administrative filings. That was not my question, the mediator stated firmly. Did she or did she not provide lawful authorization for this transfer? Richard hesitated. In a legal proceeding, silence often speaks louder than words. He could not give a direct answer. Then, something none of us anticipated happened. Vanessa Holloway cleared her throat, drawing every eye in the room. I need to make a statement, Vanessa said. Her voice trembled slightly, but she held her head up. Richard looked at her in disbelief. Vanessa, do not say a word. No, she said, shaking her head. I am not staying silent any longer. Facing severe legal exposure and the loss of her professional credentials over commercial fraud, she knew her only option was complete transparency. When Richard initially retained my services, he represented that Olivia had chosen to retire from the business. Vanessa took a deep breath. I accepted that statement at face value. But when Mr. Caldwell repeatedly requested joint authorization meetings, I formally advised Richard in writing to delay the closing until Olivia could participate in person. The entire room fell into dead silence. I issued 2 formal memorandums advising against closing without dual authorization, warning him of the severe legal risks involved. Sarah asked calmly, "Did you take part in executing that signature?" "Absolutely not," Vanessa replied without hesitation. "Did you ever witness Mrs. McAllister sign that consent document?" "No." "Did you ever hear her verbally consent to the sale?" "Never." Richard shoved his chair back and stood up abruptly. "This is completely absurd. You are all treating me like a criminal." The mediator raised a hand. "Mr. McAllister, please take your seat." Before the mediator could continue, I looked directly into Richard's eyes. "I don't think you are a criminal, Richard." My voice was surprisingly steady. "I think you are simply a man who convinced himself that his wife was no longer entitled to the truth." The anger drained right out of his face. I looked around the table at the attorneys, the consultants, and the buyer. 27 years, I said, my voice wavering slightly, though I held my ground. For 27 years, I was in that kitchen before sunrise. I missed family holidays, and I worked double shifts through sickness to keep our standards high. I watched our staff become family, and I watched our customers grow old in our dining room. I turned my focus back to Richard. I never asked for the spotlight. I never demanded fancy corporate titles. All I ever asked was to be treated as an equal partner. The room was completely still. I could have accepted a sale if it was done honestly. A tear finally rolled down my cheek. I could have accepted retirement, and I could have adapted to change. But what I will never accept, I pointed to the forged document on the table, is being erased from my own life's work. Not a single person spoke. Even Richard's attorney looked down at his legal pad. Finally, Nathan broke the silence. "Mrs. McAllister," Nathan said, looking at me. "When I entered this transaction, I thought I was buying a solid commercial asset. I realize now that I was trying to purchase the soul of a business that belongs entirely to you. Let the record show. My investment firm will not retain any asset obtained through improper representations. If the court affirms Mrs. McAllister's rightful ownership, we are fully prepared to restructure this acquisition into a joint venture." Richard stared at Nathan in disbelief. "You would undo the entire agreement?" Nathan replied calmly. "I would rather own half of an honest partnership than all of a business built on deception." A deep sense of peace washed over me. Justice did not require burning everything down. Sometimes, justice simply meant finding people who still believed that integrity mattered more than short-term gain. The mediation ended without a finalized settlement because Richard refused to sign on the spot. But the truth was out in the open. It was only a matter of time. That afternoon, I did something I had not done since the sale went down. I drove straight back to Oak and Ember. I did not slip in through the back alley, and I was not wearing my apron. I walked right through the front door like an everyday guest. The brass chime above the door rang clear. Chloe looked up from the host stand. For a second, she just stared, and then her eyes filled with tears. "Mrs. McAllister!" Before she could say another word, guests across the dining room began looking over. Eleanor was sitting in booth number 7. When she saw me, the elderly woman slowly stood up. Then, a family at the next table stood up, followed by another table. Within seconds, nearly the entire room was on their feet. There was no cue and no rehearsal, just the community's quiet, genuine way of honoring the real heart of the place. My throat tightened, and I let out a nervous little laugh. "I just came in for some lunch." Eleanor smiled softly and shook her head. "No, sweetheart, you came home." Mateo walked out from behind the swinging kitchen doors, his white apron tied around his waist. He walked across the room without saying a word and wrapped me in the tightest hug I had ever received. "You look tired," he whispered. "Maybe a little." But you look stronger. I smiled. Porch. I feel stronger. Nathan walked out of the back office, saw me and smiled warmly. I didn't expect to see you today. If you have a moment, I would love to buy you lunch. We took a seat at a table by the window. The guests respectfully sat back down, though many offered warm smiles as they passed by. Chloe brought over 2 glasses of iced tea. Porch. She set mine down with fresh lemon wedges neatly placed to the side, exactly how I liked it, knowing I preferred to squeeze my own. Some traditions never change. I spoke with our board again this morning, Nathan said once Chloe stepped away. They unanimously approved a restructured partnership proposal. As soon as the court formally validates your equity, I want you as my official co-owner. Porch. I looked at him in surprise. A partner? A full 50-50 partnership. I understand the financial and capital structures, but as you can see, he gestured toward the families and smiling staff around us. You understand the community. Regardless of the final legal formalities, I want to build the future of this place alongside the person who gave it a soul. Porch. As I was leaving, Eleanor pressed a folded piece of paper into my palm. Later that evening, sitting alone on my front porch, I opened it. Written in neat script were the words, "A house is built with lumber. A restaurant is built with recipes. But a true home that welcomes strangers is built with a caring heart." There was no signature, and none was needed. Porch. Just then, headlights turned into my driveway. It was Ethan. He walked up the porch steps, sat beside me, and handed me an envelope. "Dad asked me to give this to you. What is it?" "I don't know. I didn't read it," Ethan said quietly. After everything that had happened, he had finally learned to respect boundaries. After he drove away, I opened the envelope. Porch. Inside was no legal filing or settlement draft, just a handwritten letter on plain paper. It started with the words I had waited months to hear. "Dear Olivia." I lied. In the letter, Richard admitted he had convinced himself that taking sole control was a way of securing our financial future. He admitted he had ignored every warning from Vanessa, confusing control with leadership. Porch. One sentence stayed with me long after I finished reading. "I stopped treating you as my partner long before I lost the right to call you my wife." I rested the letter on my lap. Our marriage was undeniably over, but I understood that forgiveness and reconciliation are 2 entirely different things. Porch. You can forgive someone to free yourself from bitterness without ever allowing them back into your life. The final court hearing lasted less than 3 hours. It had taken 27 years to build this business and months to uncover the truth, but when the legal resolution arrived, it was over with remarkable speed. Richard walked into the courtroom alone, looking visibly worn down. Porch. The judge systematically examined the evidence. The original corporate filings, the restructuring documents, the fraudulent consent resolution, the forensic document report, and Nathan's sworn affidavit. When the judge looked directly at Richard and asked, "Mr. Porch. McAllister, can you produce any valid instrument executed personally by your wife transferring her equity prior to this closing?" Richard glanced at his counsel, looked down at the table, and uttered a single word. "No." The judge promptly granted summary judgment. This court finds that the ownership interest of Olivia McAllister was never lawfully conveyed. Given that the buyer, Mr. Porch, Nathan Caldwell, acted in good faith upon material misrepresentations, this court orders the transaction restructured to fully restore Mrs. McAllister's lawful 50% ownership interest, with corresponding financial adjustments. With the strike of the gavel, the matter was settled. A week later, Nathan invited me back to the restaurant. Porch. Sitting on my favorite corner table were 2 leather-bound partnership binders. "No," Lauren admitted. "She didn't mention it. But she lives there." Thomas nodded patiently. Living in a residential unit and possessing individual, fee-simple title that can be independently sold are 2 completely different legal concepts. Lauren looked thoroughly confused. "What are you talking about?" Porch. "I am telling you that Unit 614 cannot be sold separately in the manner you are proposing." Her face fell. Why not? Because it is not a condominium. Lauren stared at him, stunned. Then what is it? A regular apartment? She turned sharply to me. Are you telling me you're renting? I remained silent. Thomas continued his explanation. Porch. The entire building is held as a single multifamily commercial asset. The individual units do not have separate deeds, meaning they cannot be subdivided or sold off individually. Lauren threw her hands up in frustration. Fine then, who owns the building? Thomas paused. I looked at my daughter, who still hadn't connected the obvious dots. Porch. The real estate is held by a limited liability company, Thomas said. What company? Stevens Heritage Properties. Lauren's expression shifted slightly. She had heard that name mentioned back during our family brunch. I could see the memory slowly working its way to the surface. You mentioned that name before, she said. Yes, I did. She turned back to me. Porch. What does that company have to do with my mother? I held my tongue. Thomas answered. It has everything to do with her. Lauren looked back at him impatiently. Then explain it to me. Thomas hesitated for a second, perhaps giving me one last chance to step in and stop him. I gave him a subtle nod. Porch. Stevens Heritage Properties acquired the property approximately 17 years ago, Thomas stated. Lauren shook her head with an irritated sigh. I don't understand what all these corporate structures have to do with us. If my mom is just a tenant there, then obviously she can't sell the apartment. Fine. That actually makes things much simpler. Simpler. Porch. I wanted to see what self-serving conclusion she would jump to next. She leaned in. If she doesn't own that apartment, we don't need to worry about listing it. She can just use the cash proceeds from selling the old family house to cover our down payment. Andrew leaned back in his chair, rubbing his forehead. Lauren, please stop. No, we came here today to get this resolved. Porch. I looked directly at her. What exactly are we resolving here? Your down payment? That is your responsibility. The house you want to buy? That is entirely your concern. She glared at me. For the very first time, an unmistakable boundary had been drawn between us. Thomas folded his hands on the desk. There is one more critical detail you need to understand. Lauren looked completely exasperated. Porch. What else could there possibly be? Your core assumption regarding your mother's relationship to that building is entirely incorrect. She furrowed her brow. Didn't you just say she doesn't own the apartment? She does not hold personal title to Unit 614 as an individual condo unit. Then what does she own? Thomas glanced at me. I gave him a calm nod. He turned back to Lauren. Porch. The building. Lauren didn't react right away. It was as if the words registered in her ears, but her mind simply refused to process what they meant. What? The property is owned by Stevens Heritage Properties. I heard that part, she said, looking back and forth between Thomas and me. I am asking what my mother's connection is to that company. Thomas opened his mouth to speak. Porch. Lauren suddenly cut him off. Wait. Her eyes narrowed. For the first time, all the scattered clues began falling into place in her mind. The name Stevens. Stevens Heritage Properties. Thomas recognizing me so respectfully at brunch. The general contractors greeting me. My detailed knowledge of the building's maintenance and plumbing infrastructure. My absolute refusal to justify my lifestyle. Porch. The color slowly and completely drained from her face. No, Andrew looked between me and Thomas, completely lost. What is going on here? Lauren muttered under her breath. Mom! I met her gaze without flinching. She whipped around to face Thomas, her voice bordering on desperation. How complicated can this really be? We are just talking about a modest apartment. Porch. Thomas's expression remained completely professional. Lauren pushed the papers back toward him. Just tell me plainly who owns it. Porch. My mind flashed back to that brunch, the condescending laughter, the dismissive jokes about me brewing coffee next to my bed, the assisted living brochures they dropped in front of me, the demand for $150,000, and the respectful follow-up call from Thomas. Every single moment had led directly to this room. I looked at Thomas. You can tell her. Thomas nodded. Porch. Lauren stared at him intently. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, my daughter stopped talking and prepared herself to actually listen. Thomas did not rush his words. He understood that the heaviest truths carry the most weight when delivered with complete composure. He rested his hands on the conference table and looked straight at Lauren. "Your mother owns the entire building." Orch. Dead silence filled the room. Lauren blinked in disbelief. "What did you just say?" "The entire property," Thomas reiterated. "All 24 residential units, the common areas, the parking structure, and the underlying commercial land are owned by Stevens Heritage Properties." Lauren looked at me, then back at Thomas. "I understand the LLC owns it." Orch. "I am asking what that has to do with my mother." Thomas's voice remained calm and even. "Your mother is Stevens Heritage Properties." Andrew sat bolt upright in his chair. Lauren froze completely. I watched the reality of those words land on her like a ton of bricks. "That makes no sense." "It is fully documented," Thomas explained. Orch. "Rose is the sole, 100% member and owner of the LLC." "The sole owner?" "Yes." Lauren turned slowly toward me. "You own the company?" "I do, and that company owns the whole building?" "Yes." Her eyes went wide. "The entire building?" "The entire building." She stared at me as if the mother sitting across from her had suddenly been replaced by a wealthy stranger she had never met. Orch. Andrew was the first to find his voice. "Rose? How long?" "Robert and I acquired it 17 years ago." 17 years? "Yes." Lauren's voice dropped to a near whisper. "You and Dad owned an entire apartment complex for 17 years? We acquired several commercial properties over the years, not just that one." Her mouth opened, then closed again. Orch. I could tell she was frantically replaying decades of family memories in her head, searching for all the signs she had completely overlooked. "But you always lived in that modest suburban house." "We did." "You never said a word." Her voice trailed off into the silence. I waited. "Never said what?" "That we had built substantial wealth? That we held income-producing assets?" Orch. "That her parents had built an enterprise far beyond the modest driveway she grew up on?" Thomas quietly gathered his files, giving us as much personal space as possible without having to step out of the room. Lauren turned back to him. "That property, what is it worth?" The question came so fast it caught me off guard. Thomas paused. Orch. "I do not believe it is appropriate to discuss asset valuations without explicit authorization from my client. I am her daughter. That does not alter professional confidentiality." For the first time that afternoon, I felt a quiet sense of appreciation for his professionalism. Lauren turned back to me. "How much is it worth?" "I am not having that conversation with you." Orch. "Mom, it has to be worth millions." "Lauren, drop it," Andrew intervened firmly. "Mom, be serious. 24 units in that prime neighborhood." Andrew reached over and grabbed her arm. "Stop," she pulled her arm away. "I am just trying to understand what is happening here." "No," I said calmly. "You are trying to calculate numbers." Her face flushed bright red. "That is completely unfair." Orch. "You learned less than 60 seconds ago that I own this property, and your very first instinct was to ask how much it is worth." That stopped her in her tracks. Andrew lowered his head in embarrassment. Thomas remained quiet. Lauren swallowed hard. "I was just completely caught off guard." "I understand." Orch. "I thought." She glanced toward the window, struggling for words. "I honestly thought you were renting a small place. You never genuinely asked me." "I did ask." "No. You asked how high my monthly expenses were. You asked where the proceeds from the house sale went. You questioned my retirement accounts and your father's life insurance policy." I leaned forward slightly. Orch. "You never once asked why I chose to live in that particular building." Lauren looked at me defensively. "You let me believe you were struggling. I let you believe the assumptions you had already made on your own. That is the exact same thing." "No, it is entirely different." My voice grew stronger. "I never told you I was broke. I never claimed I couldn't afford a larger home." Orch. "I never said Unit 614 was all I had left in the world. You chose to see what confirmed your own narrative, And I didn't correct you because I hoped my daughter could respect my choices as a person without needing to see a balance sheet to treat me with basic dignity. Her eyes welled with tears for a moment. Part of me felt an urge to reach across the table and comfort her. Porch. But then I remembered the brunch, the condescending smirks, the patronizing remarks about my compact apartment and my older car, and the senior living brochures pushed across the table. I kept my hands resting firmly in my lap. Lauren shook her head. This feels like some kind of test. It was never a test. It certainly feels like one. Porch. I moved into Unit 614 because I genuinely wanted to live there. Why choose the smallest unit in the entire place? Because it happened to be vacant at the time. It was that simple, and for me, it was more than enough space. She let out a dry, bitter laugh. You own 24 units, and you picked the smallest one. Yes. Why? Because I only sleep in one bed at night. Porch. A single bedroom is all I need. That simple truth seemed to frustrate her more than any complex financial explanation ever could. You could have lived anywhere you wanted. That is correct. She went quiet. I could see the internal conflict eating away at her. She had spent years believing that living simply was a sign of failure, assuming I had no other options. Porch. Now she was forced to realize that living simply was a deliberate choice I made freely. Thomas finally spoke up. Mrs. Mitchell, there is an important distinction here. Your mother's living arrangements were never evidence of financial hardship. They were simply her personal preference. Lauren shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Porch, Thomas added. Furthermore, because Unit 614 is part of an indivisible multifamily commercial asset, it cannot be legally separated or sold off to fund another residential purchase. The sheer entitlement of her plan was now completely exposed. Porch. Lauren stared down at the floor plan she had brought along, with the guest suite circled in pen, the projected mortgage figures, and the demand for $150,000. Every single calculation had been built on a foundation of pure arrogance and flawed assumptions. Andrew leaned back with a heavy sigh. I told you we were stretching our finances way too thin. Porch. Lauren gave him a sharp look. Not now, Andrew. Yes, now, Lauren. His expression hardened. This stopped being about buying a home the moment you decided to use your mother's security to finance our lifestyle. Thomas shifted slightly in his seat. It was clear we had moved past commercial real estate into deeply personal family territory. Thomas, I said quietly, thank you for your time. Porch. He understood immediately. I will give you all some privacy. He gathered the remaining folders, stood up, and quietly exited the room, closing the door behind him. Now it was just the three of us. Lauren looked up at me. Does Emily know about this? I paused for a second. Yes. Her expression turned to pure disbelief. You told Emily before you told your own daughter? Porch. Emily noticed things on her own, asked genuine questions, and I confirmed them. She is 16 years old. This isn't about age. Then what is it about? Tears began streaming down Lauren's face. You trusted a teenager over me. I felt the weight of that statement. Beneath all her pretension and entitlement, there was genuine hurt. Porch. I trusted Emily because when she asked me questions, she wasn't judging me beforehand. Lauren looked away. My tone softened. She saw the building maintenance staff asking for my guidance. She saw that I understood how the building operated, and she was genuinely curious. You were not. It pained me to say it, but it was the truth. Porch. You looked at my apartment and immediately decided I was someone to pity or take over for. Lauren wiped beneath her eyes. I was just worried about you. Part of your concern was real. All of it was real. No, I looked straight into her eyes. You were worried, but at the same time, you were embarrassed by me. Her expression shifted completely. Porch. She knew I had spoken the uncomfortable truth she had tried so hard to hide. At brunch, you ridiculed my home right in front of Thomas. I was just joking around. You made fun of the car I drive. I didn't mean anything by it. The way you talked about assisted living made it sound like I had lost the mental capacity to decide where I want to live. I was just planning ahead for you. Porch. You even told Thomas that I probably had no realistic sense of what my property was actually worth. Lauren froze instantly. She glanced nervously toward the closed door. He told you that too? Yes. Her shoulders completely sank. She had nowhere left to hide and no defense left to offer. I shouldn't have said that. No, you shouldn't have. I'm sorry. I believe she meant it, but an apology offered only after the disguise has been completely stripped away is always complicated. I nodded slowly. Thank you. She stared at me for a long time, processing everything. Then, in a low, quiet voice, she asked, "Why didn't Dad ever tell me either?" That question softened me a little. Because your father believed our finances were our own personal business, but I'm family. He knew that. I offered a bittersweet smile. Robert never wanted money to become the focal point of our family. He wanted you to know you were deeply loved, not spend your life calculating what you might inherit someday. Lauren closed her eyes. Andrew sat beside her in complete silence. Then she looked back up. Is that the only property you two kept quiet about? I almost laughed at how predictable the pattern was. No. Her eyes snapped open. What else is there? 2 smaller rental properties. Lauren stared at me in disbelief. And investment portfolios? Yes. And the proceeds from selling the old house? All invested? Yes. She leaned back in her chair, as though the very walls of the room were shifting around her. For years, she had measured my life strictly by what was visible on the surface. Now everything that had been quietly built behind the scenes was rushing over her like a tidal wave. Yet I felt no sense of victory. That surprised even me. Ever since Thomas first called, I had played this exact moment over and over in my head. A small part of me thought seeing Lauren realize how wrong she had been would bring some kind of vindicating satisfaction. It didn't. She was still my daughter. Her humiliation did nothing to heal my pain. I reached across the table, resting my hand directly over the photograph of the luxury townhouse. There is one thing you weren't wrong about. Lauren looked at me. My apartment is small. Andrew nearly cracked a faint smile. Lauren didn't, I continued. Where you were wrong is what that small space actually represents. She lowered her gaze. I understand now. No, sweetheart, I really don't think you do. She lifted her head. I lived in a large house when it made sense for that season of my life. I live in a compact apartment now because it suits where I am today. Neither of those spaces defines my worth as a person. A single tear slid down her cheek. I let the quiet sit between us for a moment. Then, Lauren's eyes drifted down to the numbers scribbled on her notepad. Her expression shifted, just a tiny fraction, but I recognized it instantly. It was that familiar spark of calculation taking over the moment the initial shock began to fade. Mom, she began cautiously, if that entire building generates that kind of income. Andrew closed his eyes in sheer embarrassment. Before she even finished the sentence, I knew exactly what was coming. Then $150,000 wouldn't actually be a burden for you at all, right? In that exact second, the ultimate truth crystallized for me. Revealing the reality of my assets hadn't solved the underlying issue. It had simply stripped away the pretense. For a moment, I honestly wondered if Lauren even realized what she had just said. But Andrew certainly did. He buried his face in his hands, shaking his head in absolute defeat. Lauren, please, stop talking. She snapped around to face him. I am just asking a completely reasonable question. No, he said, his voice flat with quiet despair. You are proving her exact point. She glared at him. What point? You're counting her money. Lauren turned right back to me. A chaotic mix of emotions played across her face. Embarrassment, frustration, desperation, and an unsettling sense of relief. An hour ago, she had been worried I was running out of funds. Now that she knew I had more than enough, her entitlement had simply found a new justification. I leaned back against my chair. No, she blinked. What? My answer is no. To the whole amount? To funding your townhouse. Her mouth opened slightly. But you just said, I didn't say anything about giving you money. You own an entire apartment building. I do. And 2 other properties? Yes. So $150,000 wouldn't change your lifestyle in the slightest. I locked eyes with her. That is not the standard I use to decide how I share my resources. Orch. What does that even mean? It means you don't get to decide that an amount is small enough for someone else just to justify why you should have it. I am your daughter. I know who you are. The words came out sharper than she intended, and even Lauren flinched at her own tone. I kept my voice calm. Because you are my daughter, I am going to tell you something you really don't want to hear. Orch. She crossed her arms defensively. You cannot afford that townhouse. You have no idea what our finances look like. Then prove me wrong. Walk me through the numbers. We already have a pre-approval letter from the bank. A pre-approval only tells you the maximum amount an institution is willing to lend you. It never means you can comfortably afford to carry that debt. Orch. Andrew looked at me, and this time I saw clear agreement in his eyes. Lauren caught it immediately. Don't do that. Andrew frowned. Don't do what? Don't sit there acting like she understands our household budget better than we do. Andrew let out a dry, exhausted laugh. Clearly, we don't understand our own budget either. The tension in the room spiked. Lauren stared at him. Orch, what is that supposed to mean? He turned to me. Rose, there is something you don't know. Lauren cut in sharply. Andrew, do not say a word. He ignored her completely. We are carrying significant credit card debt. I waited in silence. Lauren's face went completely pale. Orch. Carrying high-interest consumer debt is a common trap, but for someone like Lauren, who built her entire identity on the appearance of effortless success, admitting it felt worse than anything else. How much? I asked. Andrew stated a number. I didn't react outwardly, but the balance was substantial, far higher than I would have ever guessed. Andrew. Lauren's voice carried a sharp warning. Orch. No, he said firmly. I am done pretending. She looked furious. That is our private business. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. Private? I looked at Lauren, who realized the irony a second too late. For weeks, my personal financial privacy had been treated like a family project to dissect and manage. Now that the spotlight turned on her, privacy suddenly became sacred. Orch. Andrew continued. We've been rolling those balances over for nearly 2 years. What caused it? I asked. A lot of things. Lauren interjected. We don't need to go over an itemized receipt of our lives. Andrew looked at her. That mindset is the exact reason we are sitting here asking for help today. She glared at him, completely speechless. Orch. He went on. The kitchen remodel went way over budget, so we put the remainder on the cards. I pictured that kitchen. The imported backsplash, high-end appliances, and custom cabinetry that Lauren insisted would dramatically increase their home value. Then there was the trip to California. Andrew, Lauren pleaded, that was our anniversary. I know what it was, he said tiredly. Orch. And then extra expenses for Emily's school. Don't put this on Emily. I'm not. I'm saying we kept spending as if next month's income would magically cover this month's overages. Lauren's eyes welled with tears again. Andrew looked completely drained. We make the minimum payments, and then something new comes up. Orch. New furniture, vacations, designer clothes, dinners at upscale restaurants, constant upgrades for the house. Lauren shook her head. You agreed to all of those things too. I did, Andrew admitted, which caught her off guard. I'm not pinning this entirely on you. I went right along with it. He looked at me. I should have said no a long time ago. Orch. I felt a genuine respect for his honesty in that moment. Lauren sat completely rigid. Suddenly, that luxury townhouse wasn't a symbol of upward mobility anymore. It was a house of cards ready to collapse on top of debt they hadn't even begun to pay down. If you took on that property, how much would your fixed monthly obligations increase? I asked. Andrew gave the figure. Lauren stayed silent. Orch. I ran the mental math. The new mortgage, property taxes, home insurance, high HOA dues, existing credit card minimums, and Emily's upcoming college tuition. I shook my head. You don't need $150,000. Lauren looked up, a faint glimmer of hope returning. I mean the very best thing you can do is walk away from that property entirely. George. The hope vanished instantly. Mom, please. You don't realize what that place would do for our family. I know exactly what it would do. It would put a polished facade over a deeply unstable financial situation. She pulled back. That is incredibly harsh. No. George. Watching you walk into a financial crisis that I could see coming, just because I was afraid of making you upset, that would be truly harsh. Lauren wiped a tear away. You have the means to fix this. I had been waiting for that statement. It was never just about the townhouse. It was about the whole dynamic. You could help us clear those credit cards, she pleaded, her voice cracking. George. That would free up our monthly cash flow, and then buying the home would work. I shook my head. No. Her expression crumbled. Why? Because paying off debt without addressing the spending habits that created it solves absolutely nothing. 6 months from now, you would be right back in the same hole. So this is a lesson for me? No. It feels like a punishment. It isn't punishment. George. Then what is it? It is a boundary. She let out a bitter laugh. That's a convenient way to put it. No, Lauren. Writing a check to make the discomfort go away would be the easy, convenient way out. Silence fell over the table. I leaned in gently. I love you too much to confuse enabling with genuine support. She turned her head away. George. When you were a little girl learning to ride a bike and you fell, I picked you up. But I didn't carry you everywhere for the rest of your life just to keep you from ever falling again. I am not a child anymore. Then I need to treat you like an adult. Those words settled heavily in the room. Andrew looked at me. What would you do if you were in our shoes? Lauren snapped her head around. George. Are you serious right now? He ignored her. If you were in our position, what would your next step be? First, walk away from the townhouse completely. He nodded slowly. Second, write down a complete, transparent breakdown of every single debt, interest rate, minimum payment, and recurring expense you have. Lauren groaned softly. I know how a budget works. George. Knowing how a budget works and actually living within one are two completely different disciplines, I told her. I continued. Stop spending money to project success and start managing it to build genuine security. Nobody spoke. For Lauren, that was probably the hardest truth to hear and the hardest to deny. That townhouse had never been about square footage. It was about status. George. The perception of her colleagues, her friends, and her clients had slowly become more important than practical common sense. Finally, Andrew asked, Would you help us work through this? Yes, Lauren looked up. Not with capital, I clarified. Not the way you're asking for. I thought for a moment. I will gladly cover the cost of a reputable, professional financial counselor for you both. George. Lauren tensed up. I don't need counseling or someone managing our personal lives. You need an objective third party. Andrew nodded. I think we really do. She looked at him as if he had broken ranks. He reached over and took her hand. Lauren, we can't keep living like this. The stress is wearing us out. At first, Lauren tried to pull her hand away. George. But after a few seconds of resistance, she let him hold it. I watched my daughter begin to cry. Not an angry performative cry, but quiet, steady tears. The kind of crying that happens when keeping up appearances becomes far heavier than simply admitting the truth. I just wanted nice things, she whispered. My heart softened completely. I know. I wanted Emily to have more what? George. Lauren didn't finish the thought, but that was the heart of the matter. More space, more prestige, more proof that her parents had arrived. I reached across the table and took her other hand in mine. Your daughter already has a home, I said gently as she looked at me through her tears. She has 2 parents who love her. She has a safe bedroom, food on the table, and access to a great education. George. Don't teach her that what she has is worthless just because someone else has a rooftop patio. Another tear rolled down her cheek. For the first time since this conversation started, Lauren didn't argue back. Andrew squeezed her hand gently. I'm sorry, he told her. She looked at him. Me too. I knew that apology wasn't meant only for Andrew. But I didn't demand she apologize to me right then. Orch, it wasn't the time. Some apologies need space and time to become real. We left Thomas's office that afternoon without putting in an offer on the townhouse. Lauren walked ahead of us toward the elevators. Just before the doors opened, she turned around to face me. "Are you disappointed in me?" Hearing that question broke my heart more than any of the sharp words from earlier. "Orch, I am disappointed by some of the choices you've made." She swallowed hard. "That's not what I asked." "I know," I stepped closer. "You are my daughter. I can love you with all my heart and still tell you no." Her eyes welled up again. The elevator arrived and we stepped inside. For the first time in months, nobody talked about my apartment. Nobody mentioned my age. Nobody brought up my assets. Orch. The townhouse faded completely out of the picture that afternoon. Their debt didn't vanish, of course. And the strain between Lauren and me didn't disappear overnight either. Those things take time. I realized then that rebuilding a family is a lot like restoring an old building. If you only care about curb appeal, you can slap fresh plaster over the cracks and call it a day. Orch. But if you want the structure to stand strong for years to come, you have to get down to the foundation, find out why it cracked in the first place, and do the slow, steady work of making it right. 3 months later, Lauren invited me out to brunch. Not at that trendy downtown spot with the marble tables and $20 omelets, but at a simple neighborhood cafe 10 minutes from my apartment. Orch. When I arrived, she was already sitting by the window. No real estate agents, no leather portfolios, no elaborate projections, just my daughter and 2 cups of coffee. "I ordered yours black," she said. "You remembered." I always remember. Something about her had shifted. It wasn't a loud transformation. Orch. Lauren was still dressed sharply, her hair was still neatly done, and her handbag probably still cost more than I would ever spend on an accessory. But she seemed more grounded, like someone who was no longer performing for an invisible audience. "How have things been?" I asked. She gave a small smile. "Much better." Orch. After stepping away from the townhouse deal, Andrew and Lauren had followed through on my recommendation. They started seeing a financial counselor. Their initial session lasted nearly 3 hours. Lauren later admitted she hated every single minute of it. They had to lay out every debt, every card balance, every recurring expense, every subscription, and every installment plan. Orch. The counselor showed them the exact amount they had spent over the past year just to maintain an image they couldn't afford. The total had shocked them both. They formally withdrew from the home search. Then they started cutting other expenses. A planned luxury vacation, 2 expensive club memberships, and an order of custom furniture Lauren had already put a deposit on. Orch. Andrew sold an RV they rarely used, and Lauren began bringing her lunch to work during the week. Those changes didn't fix everything overnight, but that wasn't the point. For the first time in years, they were moving in the right direction. "We finished paying off our first credit card yesterday," Lauren shared. "That's wonderful. It was the smallest balance. It is still a real step forward." Orch. She laughed softly. "Andrew actually wanted to print the zero balance confirmation and frame it on the wall. I'm liking him more and more." Lauren laughed genuinely. Hearing that laugh meant the world to me. It was the first time in months we had shared a light-hearted moment that carried no underlying tension or agenda. Then, her tone grew serious. "Mom, I owe you a real apology." Orch. I listened quietly. "I apologized for bits and pieces of how things went down," she continued. "But I don't think I ever apologized for the real heart of it." I waited. She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. "I was embarrassed by your apartment." Hearing that level of honesty caught me off guard. Orch. Not because there was anything wrong with the place itself. She tried to find the right words. "I was terrified that if people saw it, they would think you were struggling and that our family was slipping backward. After Dad passed, I watched you clear out so much. The house, the furniture, the clothes, all the things connected to my childhood memories. She looked down. Porch. Instead of asking what those things meant to you now, I decided on my own what getting rid of them had to mean. My throat tightened. Lauren went on. I thought your world was shrinking. I was just rebuilding it. I understand that now. She looked out the window. I got caught in this endless cycle of comparison. Porch. Comparing our home to other people's homes, comparing clothes, vacations, the school districts my colleagues lived in. She shook her head. Someone always has more. There will always be someone with more. I know, she turned back to me. That townhouse felt like a way to prove something. To prove what? Her answer was quiet, but clear, that I had made it. Porch. I understood that feeling far better than she realized. When I found out you owned the whole building, she continued, I felt completely foolish. I never imagined that was the reality. I know. And then I did something even worse. What was that? My immediate reaction was thinking your resources could just solve all my problems. I respected that she didn't try to sugarcoat it. Porch. When I heard myself ask if that money would be a burden to you. She closed her eyes briefly. I felt sick to my stomach. I reached across the table. Guilt by itself changes nothing unless you use it as motivation to make better choices. I am trying. I know you are. She held my hand tightly. After a moment, she said, Emily told me something recently. I raised an eyebrow. Porch. What did she say? She told me what Grandpa used to say all the time. I smiled. Own what gives you freedom. Lauren nodded. And don't buy things just to prove you can afford them. She smiled back. That sounds exactly like him. Emily said you shared that with her. I did. Lauren gave a soft, wistful smile. I wish I had paid more attention to those lessons when he was still here. Porch. Me too, sometimes. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Lauren reached into her bag. For a split second, I wondered if another brochure was coming out. Instead, she pulled out a small envelope. What is this? Just something I found. Inside was an old photograph. It was Robert, Lauren, and me standing in front of that worn-down duplex we had purchased decades ago. Porch. Lauren was about 8 years old, wearing a second-hand denim jacket. Robert was holding a paint roller, and I had a smudge of paint across my cheek. All three of us were laughing without a care in the world. I found it in one of the boxes you packed when you downsized the house, Lauren said. I looked down at the photograph. I had forgotten this even existed. Porch. I remember that day, she touched the print gently. I remember Dad always fixing things around the property, and I remember drawing on the floor while you two worked. The rest of that day blurred together. I stayed in the guest room until the noise downstairs died down into a quiet holiday routine. Porch. When I finally came downstairs, everyone acted as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Polite smiles, casual small talk. Chloe avoided my eyes a bit more than usual, but my father was unusually warm and upbeat. It was as if nothing consequential had happened at all. I played along, keeping up appearances just as I always had. But deep inside, a fundamental shift had taken place. Porch. The words I had overheard kept replaying in my mind, not as an open wound anymore, but as a clear, unmistakable warning. She wouldn't get it. The phrase echoed until it lost its sting and transformed into absolute clarity. That night, back in the guest room, I lay listening to the quiet of the house. I had no desire to cry, and I felt no need to prove myself to anyone. Porch. I simply felt a calm, steady resolve that was almost unsettling. I hadn't lost my family on Christmas morning. I had simply seen them clearly for the very first time. And once your eyes are opened, you can never go back to pretending you don't know the truth. The morning after Christmas felt completely ordinary, and that was the most jarring part of all. Porch. Pale winter sunlight filtered through the curtains, falling across the same furniture and the same walls, illuminating a comfortable domestic routine that felt completely unchanged. Downstairs, the regular morning sounds carried up. The drip of the coffee maker, the quiet clatter of ceramic mugs. Porch. The house kept functioning as if nothing had shifted. As if a shiny red sports car hadn't just completely redefined my role in this family overnight. I lay there for a while, staring at the ceiling, listening. Nobody came upstairs to see if I was awake, and nobody checked in to see how I was doing. The indifference wasn't dramatic or loud. It was quiet and seamless, which made it all the more undeniable. What had fractured inside me hadn't even registered with them. When I finally went downstairs, the car was sitting in the driveway, visible through the garage windows like a polished monument to the whole situation. Chloe was already dressed, eagerly discussing taking it out for a drive later on. My father nodded along over his coffee, looking more relaxed than I had seen him in years. They looked completely content and at ease. I realized right then that the shock I was carrying didn't exist in their world. To them, it was just another pleasant morning. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and sat down at the kitchen table, moving slowly and deliberately. Nobody spoke to me directly. The conversation flowed around me like water, never landing in my direction. I watched Chloe laugh and my father smile, and something inside me quietly clicked shut for good. This was never just about a car. It had never been about the car. As the morning passed, memories I had kept pushed down began assembling themselves like puzzle pieces, forming a complete picture I had spent years refusing to look at. I remembered how proud I felt the very first time I sent a portion of my paycheck home. I remembered the first Thanksgiving I missed, because I picked up an extra holiday shift for double pay. I remembered telling myself that it was fine, that I didn't need much for myself anyway. Every single one of those moments carried a very different meaning now. I remembered a birthday years ago, when Chloe received the expensive gift she had been talking about for months. While my birthday came with a hug from my father and a quiet thank you for being so understanding. I remembered I'm standing in my chilly, poorly heated apartment in Wicker Park, assuring my father over the phone that I could cover the bill, even though my stomach tied in knots after checking my account balance. I remembered how running myself ragged had been praised as great work ethic, and how my genuine exhaustion had been brushed off as overthinking things. The hardest part to accept was that none of this had been done with open hostility. There were no obvious villains, no dramatic confrontations. There was just a quiet, unspoken arrangement. I was expected to provide support without limits. They were comfortable receiving it, and we all labeled that dynamic as family loyalty. "You're the strong one in the family." The phrase echoed in my mind, completely stripped of its warm facade. I had worn that label like armor, thinking it meant I had earned real respect. But sitting at that table, watching my family revolve around a lifestyle funded by my efforts while excluding me from it, I finally recognized the label for what it truly was. It wasn't praise. It was permission. Permission to lean on me without second thought. Permission to stop asking how I was doing. Permission to assume that whenever things went sideways, I would always be there to absorb the impact. Being labeled the strong one never meant being valued. It simply meant being the one who was expected to sacrifice. I excused myself from the table and stepped outside for a walk, needing room to breathe. The freezing Chicago wind hit my face, grounding me in the reality of the moment. I walked down the familiar suburban streets of Naperville, letting the memories surface without trying to push them away. Whenever the family faced a financial crunch, I was the default solution. Whenever Chloe needed time to figure out her next steps, I was the safety net. When times were tough, I was the foundation. When things were good, I became invisible. The car wasn't an anomaly. It was the natural outcome of a pattern that had been running for years. The realization settled in as a deep, steady ache. I remembered how often I had defended them to others, and how often I had justified things to myself, telling myself they didn't mean anything by it, that they were under pressure, that families are just complicated. Without realizing it, I had become their translator, their excuse maker, and their personal cushion against reality. Intent does not erase impact. The thought formed clearly and firmly in my mind. Maybe my father hadn't set out to intentionally hurt me. Maybe Chloe hadn't consciously planned to take advantage of the situation. But the end result was identical. I was exhausted, overlooked, and expected to keep smiling through it all. Support that requires you to erase your own needs isn't genuine support. It's simply an unfair obligation disguised as loyalty. When I returned to the house, the atmosphere was unchanged. They were making plans, with Chloe listing the friends she wanted to visit and show the car to later in the afternoon. Nobody asked if I wanted to come along. Nobody asked what my plans were for the day. In that moment, everything became entirely clear. My presence was optional, my financial support was assumed, and my personal feelings were completely irrelevant. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the guest bed, and pulled out my phone. Without hesitating, I opened the Chase banking app. The familiar list of scheduled recurring transfers appeared on the screen, neat and organized, like a set of obligations I had committed to years ago. For the first time, looking at those numbers didn't bring a sense of duty or accomplishment. It brought detachment. I pictured what the next few years would look like if nothing changed. More overtime shifts, more Zelle transfers, and more of my own plans quietly set aside simply because I was capable of managing the burden. I knew how easy it would be to keep the peace and maintain the status quo. I had spent most of my adult life doing just that. Then I acknowledged how deeply exhausted I really was. Not just physical tiredness, but a deep weariness from holding my breath for years. I didn't cancel any transfers right then, and I didn't alter the accounts immediately. I wasn't going to make an impulsive move in that exact moment. Looking at the screen, I simply allowed myself to accept one necessary conclusion. This has to end. Not with a screaming match today, but soon. The current arrangement could not continue. For the rest of the day, I watched my family with complete clarity. I noticed how easily my absence from conversations went unnoticed, and how quickly financial concerns were dismissed with the casual assumption that things would always somehow work themselves out. After all, they always managed to land on their feet, because every single time things went sideways, I was quietly picking up the tab in the background. Lying in bed that night, an unexpected sense of calm settled over me. The overwhelming anger I thought would consume me never arrived. Instead, it was replaced by something far more solid: acceptance. Not acceptance of an unfair situation, but acceptance of an undeniable truth. I had spent years playing a role that no longer fit, and no amount of explanation or personal sacrifice was ever going to change that script. I remembered who I was before this heavy sense of familial obligation swallowed me whole. The woman who moved to Chicago on her own, building a life from scratch without a safety net. The woman who carried personal dreams that had nothing to do with bailing everyone else out. She had not vanished. She was simply buried under decades of assumed responsibility. That realization was both painful and liberating. Painful because I had to face how long I had enabled this dynamic, but liberating because it meant that, from this moment forward, I had the power to make a completely different choice. The luxury sports car no longer felt like an unbearable weight on my chest. It became a clear turning point, a piece of undeniable evidence forcing me to wake up. It laid the entire pattern out in sharp relief, making it impossible to pretend anymore. As the house fell completely quiet and the night wound down, I lay in the dark reflecting on the concept of boundaries. In traditional family environments, drawing a line with relatives is often branded as selfishness. But right now, it felt absolutely essential. Caring about family does not require self-erasure. Being a daughter does not mean serving as a permanent, unquestioning safety net. I did not know the exact timeline or the specific steps I would take next. I only knew that a change was inevitable. The reality of the situation was now impossible to unsee, and once your perspective shifts that completely, there is no going back. David slowly unfolded the document, smoothing out each crease with deliberate, professional composure. He adjusted his glasses and scanned the text. He did not look upset in the slightest. He looked genuinely amused. Without a word, David passed the page to Kendra. Kendra placed it directly beneath the high-resolution document camera connected to the display system. Porch. Within seconds, Calvin's so-called contract was projected onto the large screen for every person in the room to read clearly. David turned toward Thomas and Victoria, addressing Connor's parents directly so they fully understood the reality of the situation. "This is an interesting document," David announced, his tone measured and direct. "Porch. As everyone can see at the top of the page, this paper uses the official letterhead of Calvin Contracting LLC. He claims Maya diverted $500,000 from this specific corporate account to fund her lifestyle." David paused, allowing the tension in the room to build. Valerie stopped pacing. "Porch." Her phone remained pressed against her ear, the dispatcher on the other end still asking for clarification. Calvin broke into a cold sweat, his eyes darting toward the front entrance as if calculating whether he could simply slip away. David continued laying out the facts, turning his attention toward Connor, who remained behind his parents. "Porch. Calvin's corporate records present a fatal flaw for this claim. His contracting business was already insolvent, and certified account statements confirm that at the time Calvin alleges these funds were taken, the account held nowhere near that amount. Regardless of what is written on this page, the verified financial records completely contradict it. This document is entirely fraudulent." Porch. A collective gasp swept through the guests. Sister Beatrice let out a dramatic murmur of disbelief, fanning herself rapidly with her program. Thomas's face flushed a deep red as he realized the fabricated narrative he had been fed. Victoria placed a hand over her chest, her eyes wide with shock. "Porch." Molly sat down on the hardwood floor, overcome with emotion as the elaborate lifestyle she had envisioned unraveled completely. Valerie's hand went limp, and her phone slipped from her fingers, clattering against the imported flooring, while the dispatcher's voice faintly echoed from the speaker. Calvin staggered backward, bracing himself heavily against a marble console table. Porch. In front of the very social circle he had tried so hard to impress, his claims were completely dismantled, exposing the entire scheme for what it was. I stood perfectly still, watching a toxic structure built on my hard work reach its absolute, unavoidable conclusion. The heavy silence that followed David's presentation was suddenly broken by the sound of approaching sirens. Porch. The noise cut through the coastal breeze, growing louder and more urgent by the second. Red and blue lights began flashing through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting sharp, alternating colors across the startled faces in the room. Valerie had called emergency services earlier, convinced that law enforcement would act as her personal removal team. Porch. She had tried to leverage the authorities against me, expecting me to be escorted out of my own home, assuming her tears would immediately sway the responding officers. 2 uniformed officers entered through the open front doors, their steady footsteps echoing across the hardwood floor. Porch. They took one look around the grand space and recognized right away that this was not a routine residential disturbance. They were standing in the middle of a formal gathering attended by notable professionals and prominent local figures. Porch. The lead officer, a tall man with silver hair at his temples, scanned the room before asking clearly who had placed the emergency call regarding a property dispute. What followed would bring a definitive close to the evening. Valerie pushed past the gathered guests, squeezing past Connor's parents to reach the 2 deputies. Porch. Driven by a surge of pure panic, she pointed a trembling finger straight at me, her expression contorted with theatrical distress. "Officer, thank goodness you're here," Valerie cried out, her voice trembling. "That woman is my daughter. She diverted $500,000 from our family business and used it to purchase this property. We have a signed commercial agreement right here proving it. Porch. We came today to secure what belongs to us, and she refuses to vacate. She even hired these people to intimidate us. The lead officer looked at me, glanced over at the well-dressed guests holding champagne flutes, and finally turned his focus toward Calvin. My father was still leaning heavily against the console table, clutching the crumpled paper in his fist. Torch. The officer stepped toward him, asking calmly to inspect the official contract Valerie had just referenced. Calvin swallowed hard, visibly terrified. The aggressive posture he had displayed only 10 minutes earlier had completely evaporated. He was used to browbeating family members, but he knew that dynamic had zero effect on law enforcement. His hands shook noticeably as he handed the page over. Torch. Before the deputy could finish reading the opening paragraph, David stepped forward with calm, professional precision. "Officer, my name is David, and I am the corporate attorney representing the lawful deed holder of this property, Ms. Maya Lauren Brooks," David said, handing over his business card. Torch. "The woman who placed the emergency call is Valerie, and the individual who handed you that page is Calvin. They arrived today with a commercial moving truck with the explicit intent of unlawfully taking possession of my client's real estate." David gestured toward the screen. "The document in your hands is fraudulent. Torch. They are attempting to use it to substantiate a baseless claim against my client's title. We have the verified financial records ready for inspection." The deputy assessed David's professional presentation, then glanced at Calvin's visibly panicked expression, asking David to clarify the discrepancy. Torch. David pointed to the large monitor, displaying my certified banking records and the official property deed. "I have already presented notarized filings, proving my client acquired this property entirely through her independent savings and documented business earnings," David explained, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet room. Torch. "The paper Calvin provided alleges funds were diverted from his contracting firm. However, certified bank records show his enterprise was insolvent and never held $500,000 during the period in question. The objective financial trail directly refutes his claim. Every underlying statement is available for review." The deputy's expression hardened. Torch. He examined the document carefully, looking closely at the corporate letterhead Calvin had foolishly utilized. While not a financial auditor, the officer knew how to spot a manufactured claim when the dates failed to align. He compared the timeline on the page with the highlighted records on the screen. The math did not work. The sequence of events was impossible. Torch. The entire story had been hastily assembled out of financial desperation. Thomas and Victoria watched the exchange in complete disbelief. Connor's parents stood just a few feet away, witnessing the complete unraveling of the claims they had been told. Sister Beatrice and the church members fell into stunned silence, their murmuring replaced by a heavy stillness. Torch. The lead deputy folded the paper and placed it securely into an evidence pouch. His voice lowered with unmistakable authority. "Sir," the deputy addressed Calvin directly, "there are critical contradictions between this paper and the certified financial records presented. I am retaining this document as part of our report while we determine the appropriate legal steps." Torch. "You are advised to cease all attempts to enter, occupy, or claim any interest in this property." The officer's directive hit Calvin like a physical blow. Any remaining composure vanished, leaving him looking frail and defeated. The reality of his actions finally broke through his defenses. There was no primary suite waiting for him. There was no grand impression to be made on Connor's parents. Torch. There would be no seaside retirement funded by my accounts. Instead, he was facing serious legal scrutiny for documentary fraud. Calvin began stepping backward immediately, stammering apologies with his hands raised in full surrender, stumbling over his own footing as the gravity of his legal exposure set in. The next step was approaching quickly. Torch. I could feel it lingering right on the edge of my awareness. And for the first time in years, that uncertainty did not paralyze me. Instead, it served as a clear wake-up call, reminding me that I was finally seeing things as they were. That morning, I woke up before anyone else in the house. The entire space was wrapped in a quiet stillness that felt unfamiliar. Porch. Outside, the sky was still dark, and the neighborhood seemed suspended in silence. I sat up slowly in bed, listening to the calm. For the first time in days, my thoughts were not racing. They were ordered, steady, and focused. This was not the morning after an explosive confrontation. It was the morning after complete clarity, and that clarity changed the entire dynamic. Porch. I walked down to the kitchen and sat alone on a bar stool by the island. This was the spot where I had eaten countless rushed meals, listening to conversations drift around me, quietly nodding along as financial choices were made without my input. The faint scent of yesterday's coffee still lingered in the air. I held an empty ceramic mug with both hands, letting the cool surface ground me. Porch. My phone rested flat on the counter, its screen dark and quiet. For years, my mornings had always started with the same mental calculations. How many extra shifts could I pick up? How much support could I send back? And what personal expenses did I need to trim to bridge the gap? On this morning, for the very first time, the question changed. Porch. It was no longer about how much more I could give, but how to stop sacrificing my own well-being. She smiled softly. I just never really understood what you two were building. A restructured LLC partnership agreement, Nathan said with a genuine smile. Equal equity, equal voting rights. Take your time reviewing it. I opened the leather binder. Porch. For the first time in my professional life, I was not signing based on blind trust or verbal reassurances. I read every single page, line by line, verifying every clause. You really are reading every single word, aren't you? Nathan observed with a chuckle. I will never skip a paragraph again as long as I live, I replied, picking up the pen. Porch. This time, I signed my name slowly, confidently, and deliberately. The months that followed were among the most rewarding of my entire career. Nathan modernized our accounting and back-office management, but he left every single culinary and hospitality tradition completely intact. Porch. Chloe was formally promoted to general manager, and Mateo continued leading the kitchen as executive chef, still insisting that I be the first person to taste test every seasonal recipe. Eleanor occupied booth number 7 every single Friday, though she now insisted on paying full price, stating she refused to take advantage of my hospitality any longer. Porch. On a quiet, rainy afternoon, nearly 8 months after the court entered its final summary judgment, the front entrance chime sounded softly. Richard walked through the door. There was no expensive tailored suit, no corporate briefcase, just an older man carrying the weight of deep regret. Chloe glanced over at me from the host stand. I gave her a calm, reassuring nod. Porch. I will take care of this table. Richard sat down near the front window, at the exact booth where we had planned our very first holiday menu decades ago. I walked over holding a single menu. He offered a faint, tired smile. I already know what I would like to order. The southern fried chicken and a slice of peach pie. Assuming the recipe hasn't changed, he added quietly. Porch. It never has, I said. We barely spoke throughout the meal. When he finished, he folded his linen napkin neatly and set it beside his plate. I went over this conversation 100 times in my head, he said in a low voice. I still can't seem to find the right words. The words in your letter said everything that needed to be said. Porch. I am not asking to come back into your life. He swallowed hard, looking down. I only wanted to ask, when you think back on our years together, try not to remember me only for my worst decision. I let the silence linger for a long moment. Then, I picked up the check from the table, placed my own card on top, and looked down at him. You don't need to do that, he said, reaching forward. Porch. Lunch is on the house, I told him with a calm smile. Because that is simply how we treat people who walk through these doors. His eyes welled with tears.